It is my pleasure to be able to introduce Chris Armatas. If you were not here yesterday, I'll tell you a little bit about him. Chris has, for some reason, we think that it's important to know where people get degrees rather than what they actually have accomplished. But so Chris has a bachelor's degree in economics from St. Lawrence University in the North Country of New York, and then worked for a while in seasonal jobs, and then decided it was time to do something a little more reliable, permanent, and for some reason then went to graduate school. But I've got a master's and PhD from the University of Montana in their School of Forestry and Conservation, and then moved 2 or 3, depending on how you walk, buildings south from the College of Forestry to the Aldo Leopold Wilderness Research Institute, where he's been working for the last few years. Yesterday, he told us sort of broadly about how he's been working on with land managers and others to do what we might call co-produced research. Today, he's going to actually dig a little deeper and tell us how he does that.
Thanks, Mark. How's that? People hear that all right? All right. Great. Thanks. Thanks for that introduction. Thanks again for having me. This is my last kind of talk and last few hours here with y'all, and it's been really great. Just heartfelt thank you for having me, hosting me. Noah and Irene have done an amazing job. Everyone's been so thoughtful and generous and kind, and I'm really humbled and honored to be asked to come here, and it's been nothing but an amazing experience. So I just want to say that. I'll try to get through this. They'll still leave us like 15 minutes before the end of the hour so we can chat about questions. And as yesterday was a general talk. As highlighted, today's the more specific talk, more of a deep dive. And like yesterday, I have 3 goals. The first goal is the same, which you'll see some repeat slides for those that were here, and maybe I'll move quicker through those. But for those who weren't, I'll just try to introduce myself briefly, and then Forest Service research. As I noted, not everybody knows that Forest Service has this kind of presence and the government agencies do this kind of work. So I just want to really quickly go there. And then I'm just going to do a really fast overview of public engagement, really to make the point that what I'm going to talk about more deeply is only a slice of that public engagement. And then I'll dive deep into some of the work that I've done within the context of public engagement. So yeah, I'll just kind of go through this quick self-intro and then, overview, and I'll talk about a structured approach. This is the same one as yesterday. I'm based in Missoula, Montana. I'm a research social scientist. I kind of have an interdisciplinary social ecological systems lens, and I'm a conservation social scientist. And I talked a bit about that yesterday and how I struggle to articulate what that is. But I guess first and foremost, I'm a dad to these kids, Maeve and Beckler, and that's my wife, Stephanie. And so we like to get out and do fun things. But when I'm working here at the Aldo Leopold Wilderness Research Institute, which is part of the Forest Service. For those who don't know, just governance is kind of like, if you think of 3 kind of main components of the Forest Service, there's state, private, and tribal forestry, National Forest System, which is, like the Uinta Forest Service, National Forest, grasslands, rangers, supervisors, the folks you see out there on the ground, and then research and development. So there's a whole branch dedicated to research and science to support these other branches. And I work within the Rocky Mountain Research Station, which has 9 program areas that you can see here. So for those who might be interested in going into agency research positions or science positions, and wilderness isn't your thing, there's, here's 9 places you could work: fire, fuel, and smoke. And we're a little unique at the Aldo Leopold Wilderness Research Institute in that we're interagency. So formally, we focus and work with the National Park Service, Fish and Wildlife Service, BLM, and then the Forest Service, of course, as well, which is all land management agencies that administer the National Wilderness Preservation System. Okay, so hopping into the talk. I'm going to talk about public participation and specifically a structured approach, but I just wanted to highlight that there's a lot that goes into good public participation. There's a lot of different contexts when the agencies might engage the public. Certainly there's formal like in a NEPA process, they're meant to. There's legal reasons and legal mandates that they do engage the public. And what that looks like varies widely. I think historically it was maybe just a basic public comment, mostly to meet up with those legal mandates. But increasingly, there is an interest in kind of more substantive public engagement where they really work with the public, learn from the public, the different perspectives, and try to, in some ways, depending on their approach, maybe even co-produce or collaborate with the public to come up with, a way forward. And we can think of that just broadly as communicating and involving citizens in government activities. And there's a lot that goes into it, like when you would convene, who you would get to come, when you would do it, how you make it accessible, what you talk about, all of those things. And recent publication that's out now, myself and some others went through and really synthesized that public participation literature and some of the kind of recreation literature around kind of human nature relationships, which I talked a lot about yesterday. And that's kind of here in this publication. But I'm just going to talk about one little slice of that. But what is the challenge that the slice that I'm going to talk about, I think, really helps them address? One thing they really struggle at, the agencies, when they get a bunch of people in a room or they ask them via public comment and, they interact with maybe hundreds of people in the public sphere that have all these different perspectives. How do you kind of capture and distill that input? That's really hard. The public's concern sometimes we hear is like, was I even heard? Did I just go to that meeting and skip my kids' kind of hockey practice to go and say my piece, and then it never shows up? It just went into the ether. Did they hear me? And then kind of more broadly, really meaningfully applying public input, to really in an effective and efficient way, one that kind of builds trust, builds relationships, and is really transparent. So they can kind of see, okay, I gave my information, I gave my thoughts, poured my heart out. Where did it end up? And can you show me how it made it there? And then also increasing that equity and access so everyone's voice can kind of be heard in some way. And then hopefully, like I talked about a lot yesterday, hopefully there's some level of mutual learning where people are not only going there to kind of say their piece, but also learn and hear other people's perspectives, right? And so they can really see the complexity of some of these issues. And again, I'm going to talk about a structured method, but there's a lot of ways you can do public engagement. You can hear from them with facilitated techniques like, sticky notes, open mics, those types of things. If you've ever gone to a public meeting, you can put your vote up on the board or work on the whiteboard. I mean, there's storytelling, free-flowing conversations. And I think there's a need for all of these. So I'm certainly, as I move into the structured method that myself and others have put together, we're not suggesting it's the only method. It doesn't replace everything else you need to do to build relationships and hear from people, but it's just maybe another tool in the toolbox, if you will. And so that's where these structured techniques come in. That's one of the gaps we saw. Like, there's not a lot of structure or a lot of ways that you can say, here's what we heard, here's how we took it and processed it and brought it back to folks and brought it back to managers as well, who are kind of ultimately making these decisions. Okay, so I'm going to talk about a structured approach and deep dive into several applications of this approach. And it's really, it's kind of, we've tested it in the science community and the peer-reviewed community, which is important, I think. And then also in the management community. So really trying to get it out there to managers. And it's been adopted in a lot of ways. And I'm going to speak to those here. But what is it? I keep talking about it. What's a structured approach? What is it? Really quickly, I'll overview it and then I'll kind of back up and kind of walk through the whole thing. But really, it's kind of a fun, interactive method, if I do say, folks seem to enjoy it, but really it comes down to kind of telling us about your human nature relationship in some way, in a rough way. And kind of the way we do that is we have folks prioritize benefits, ecosystem services, any framing you want to pick. We can talk about those framings, and I will in a minute, from most important to most unimportant. Like, what is it, and we make them struggle with those trade-offs, and that's really hard, but people enjoy it. And then, because everything might be important, I want all these things. And it's like, well, managers sometimes need to make those tough trade-offs. So we want you to as well. And then you also interact with all of those different things. These folks might come to this table with, this was on the Gila National Forest when they were doing their plan revision. They might come to that table with 3 things in their mind. They're meant to think about 30, which is those white cards. And I'll explain that method in a little more detail. And then the next part is drivers of change. So it's like, here's what's important to you. Here's your relationship. Here's what's important, what's unimportant. Now what's influencing that? And that's what we ask them to do. And we've done this in a variety of ways. You can do it through interviews, add some conversational data in there, but also, you know, we pre-selected drivers of change, and that's what these yellow cards are. So it's like, okay, here's what's important to me, and then, oh, maybe it's climate change impacts, maybe it's management actions that are influencing this. And so we have them do this structured activity. We have a whole bunch of people do it. Could be 160. And then what you get are these archetypes, and I'm going to show these more, so you don't need to see that right now, really, other than to say, if you have 160 people do this, you spit out about 3 to 5 of those kind of archetypical perspectives that captures that variance in the room. So this is, I'm going to back up and kind of run through this whole thing, but instead of talking about this hypothetical approach, I kind of wanted to show it to you really quick. And then you get these drivers of change that are kind of associated with these different archetypes. Okay, so just exploring some applications. That's really my hope today. I want to deep dive into this method, but I won't deep dive into any specific place or time or instance that we did it. Though, as I said yesterday, like if any of this is interesting, I'm going to talk about all these different spots in different points. If you want to follow up, please do. Always happy to talk to people. But we've really done it in the context of wilderness management. Initially, and that was actually a colleague of mine, a master's student at the Frank Church River No Return Wilderness. We've done it in forest plan revision on the Gila National Forest and the Shoshone National Forest. Wild and scenic river planning on the Flathead Wild and Scenic River system up there in Montana. Forest resiliency project on the Wall of Whitman National Forest, which was like a 70,000 acre restoration project. And they kind of used this method. Recreation and wildlife management in Routt County, Colorado is another place we recently did it. We did that in 2022. And now, right now, ongoing, I don't have any results for you. The application is open, and we just did workshops 2 weeks ago for post-fire restoration on the Mendocino National Forest. So we've kind of used this method in these different public engagement contexts, working kind of some closer with managers than others, but certainly the most recent ones have been really kind of in lockstep and full collaboration with the management on the ground. And so I'm going to kind of go through, but I wanted to give you an overview of where we've done this kind of spatially and in all these different contexts. And really what we try to do just at a basic kind of fundamental way is, you know, framing the planning issue. So initially it's what elements, I say, you know, like when you're thinking of different planning contexts, what elements of human nature relationships are most relevant to the planning process? That's where we start. And I'll talk about that in a minute. Is it ecosystem services? That becomes a framing thing, I think, a lot of the time. And then what drivers of change are influential to those human nature relationships? So I'm going to kind of walk through these kind of both together in these different contexts, but that's like the gist of it. And we have folks wrestle with those elements. I broaden that out because there's critiques of the ecosystem services framing. That's like where we started. Many of you probably read some of that. I've had nice conversations this week about some of that. So, you know, maybe moving away from that terminology in different contexts to help really communicate what people are interested in, how they interact, how they relate to that forest. I personally don't really care what you call them, just kind of helping people kind of wrap their head around how they interact with that place, whatever kind of resource you're planning around. And then the drivers of change can vary. But where you start is creating a list. So you create a list of these ecosystem services that folks will at some point rank. So this is like your pre-work before you show up in that public meeting, before you roll out an online planning tool. And in National Forest Plan revision, when you're kind of broadly looking at ecological, sociocultural, and economic sustainability, ecosystem services was a nice framing. It made sense to us. It's not only is it indoctrinated in the actual 2012 planning rule, they use that term, which is kind of what forest managers are focused on, but it really is kind of broad scale in some ways. You know, you think about timber production, water quality, air quality, recreation, and forest planning at that scale. You know, the game of this list of things that kind of represents the broad ranges of things you get off a forest at the scale, you don't necessarily drill way down to specific stuff. So ecosystem services kind of works. But again, where I'll go is you don't need to use that term. And we've changed that up and it's just fine. On the Shoshone National Forest, we came up with 34 of them. Gila National Forest, 30. And then we had these drivers that we also kind of thought about. All right, what's influencing these ecosystem services? We did a qualitative drivers discussion there. I just want to highlight like where we really sat down and did interviews. So that's a different approach. Kind of depends on capacity, when you're doing it, where you're doing it. And just those are some of the like water, when I say ecosystem, what do I mean, right? We got water quality, timber production, irrigation for agriculture, livestock grazing, public ownership and access to public land. Those are some of the things that these folks were wrangling with in these different contexts. And then how do you do that? Like, how do you create this list, right? You initially start with a huge list, like could be hundreds, but you can't really have folks wrangling with that many kind of ideas or ecosystem services or elements of the human nature relationship. So you end up boiling it down, but you really kind of consult with managers and planners. You look at the literature, you kind of the research, and you might come up with this list, kind of pare it down to what you think broadly represents kind of what people get from the forest in this case. And then you pilot test, of course, as good practice. If you can pilot test with people, that's awesome. Members of the public would be great. And then, it changed a little bit. I kind of want to highlight as we go across these applications, how things kind of change, with new framings, you're working with managers. And so when we went to wild and scenic river planning, the focus is a little more narrow, generally. There's these, as I talked about yesterday, outstandingly remarkable values kind of drill in a little bit more specifically. The spatial scale is a little more focused. So we ended up going with this even broader, felt like, human and ecological meanings and services. So we added this kind of meanings part because there were some of these that just didn't feel like services per se. And, we had feedback that folks just didn't love that kind of narrow framing. And, you're really preserving and enhancing these ORVs, at the river scale. So we had 48 of them. So you might think on a survey, well, 48, that's way too much. But actually, they kind of interact with these things and they're ranking them relative to one another. So that was not a problem for folks to kind of work through 48 of these HEMS, as we call them, or human and ecological meanings and services. And just to give you an idea, some of them were like wildlife habitat and connectivity, water quality, again. A place for wildness felt a little bit more like a meaning. There was kind of Native American history, indigenous history was another one, more of a meaning, maybe less of a service. Native American use of that corridor was another one. Dispersed camping without services. We drilled down a little more specifically in this context. And then we had 42 drivers of change that they kind of wrangled with and thought about how are my rankings and this sorting kind of influenced by these drivers. And similar methods, we worked, here's this ORVs assessment for the Flathead River system. We kind of pulled stuff out of there as a start, right? Like, where do you start? Here's something, they've articulated these values. So we kind of went through and pulled out, what the benefits were that people might think about. And, as I talk about kind of, I'm not going to walk through all of them. I just want to show you where we start. And then as we started to collaborate more with managers and integrate more with managers, the framing starts to shift, And as I noticed, the more buy-in that you can get with managers and the more invested they are in that process, the more ownership they take over and really kind of think about it. When we worked with the Wall of Whitman Resiliency Project, we stuck with ecosystem services. They were really interested in me kind of help, like, hey, can you just design this and we'll just roll it out? And I kind of did that, even though I was kind of trying to get them involved. And then when we got, and so we went with ecosystem services again. And then when we got with Routt County and Mendocino, we had full buy-in and we were kind of just sitting in the background trying to pass off this method in some ways. Support with analysis, of course, support with kind of context framing and rollout and development of some online tools as well. But they went with landscape benefits. They were like, and I know I'm harping on maybe a little too much kind of the framing or the words you use, but it does matter when you're interacting with the public, particularly when you think back to this idea yesterday about social learning and communication. And some people take offense to that service thing. Like, again, we're just we're just like sucking out all these benefits without giving anything back, it lacks that reciprocity, and maybe landscape benefits doesn't include that, but people hone in on that. So as framing start to shift, and that's okay. I guess that's my point. As you start to do more collaborative work, I found you got to let go of those reins a little bit on what everything looks like. And those lines, again, start to become a little more blurred. I just want to check my timing because I know we're going for a quarter of. And so, yeah, so that's kind of the idea here. So once you have those ecosystem services, drivers lined out, what do people do? Now I showed you this, but I want to walk through a little more. closely. So you show up to these places, which I get to soon, and what do you have all these folks do? And again, they rank order these benefits. This was just one example from most important over on the right, and the columns denote different values, but the rows do not. So you have to pick your two most important ecosystem services or landscape benefits or elements of the human nature relationship in the white cards. And then your next three most important, and then your next four, and then all the way over to your next kind of unimportant benefits over here on the left. And this is based off Q methodology, which is a social science method. So you can do this about any topic. I mean, we've kind of adapted that method and used that method for this particular application, but that's worth highlighting. So if you go Google that type of method, or you're a social scientist looking for a project method, that would be the method you look at. And what it really does is get you these divergent perspectives. But you had people do that, and then they do the drivers of change. So what's influencing that? This person said, hunting and fishing, public ownership and access is important, irrigation for ag, traditional agricultural lifestyle, livestock grazing. Those were their top 5. And then extended drought, land use restrictions on the forest, and declining Forest Service budgets were those things that they were most concerned about out of the pre-selected lists. We also allow them to write them in if they have them, that were really influential to their relationships. And then the other thing we do is we collect a little bit of demographic data. No names, none of that, just to kind of understand, do you have some kind of diverse perspectives? Because the idea here is not random sampling, it's purposeful sampling. We're not trying to figure out that these perspectives, as I'll show in a minute, are distributed across some population. We're just trying to find out what are the different perspectives that exist out there, the different shared viewpoints or the divergent shared viewpoints that kind of resist that central tendency to a mean. So you really want different perspectives. So there's limitations to how you understand that, but we often go with just a couple quick demographics. Do we have some ranges in ages, some race, ethnicity, some spatial locations in the case of a forest planning context? So you have them do this, right? And then have conversations if possible. It really is a nice kind of framework for conversations. You see people doing this all the time. They're sitting there doing this. They're leaning over, talking to each other. It's amazing what people learn about each other. I don't know. They really do enjoy it because you interact with one another. You're ranking these things. I've seen husband and wife combos, 30 years knowing each other. And she's like, what? You did that as your first one? You kidding me? Yeah. So it's kind of fun to see him do that. But you can also have, the people rolling it out have these conversations, so you can kind of get a little more nuance and depth. And I'll show what that can kind of yield in the end. But this isn't always possible, So it's flexible. We always stress this when we're working with managers. This thing's flexible. If you can't pull off some kind of interviews, then just do this part. And you can have 30 people come and do this in an hour. You don't have time to talk to every single one of them. Maybe you can talk to them in other ways. But we like that. I think that can make them a little more compelling and influential, particularly when you're communicating. And so back to this engaging with diverse perspectives. So who do you get to come do that activity I just showed you? You can do it at planning meetings, and we have in the field. We've done it online. We've done it in targeted collaborative meetings. We know people are gathering, and we'll go in and help and have them do it there. And whoever else you can find. I've done it in the field, like out at campgrounds. When I was doing the Flathead stuff, I was up and down those rivers talking to people as they got off the river. And it's a small sample methodology, so you don't need a ton of folks, and 70 is even kind of high when you look at the literature. We've, across these 7 applications, have had between 70 and 160 people do it. The Mendocino I think the Mendocino will be over that, actually. And I won't get into the weeds on some of that, but if you're interested, what are the implications about different sizes, I can talk about that as well. And so from purposeful to convenience, in a perfect world, like we did in the 2 dutiful graduate students in Wyoming and Idaho 10, 11, 12 years ago when I did this, we did real, theoretically, dimensional sampling where you're like, here's the 6 or 7 stakeholder groups or rights holder groups that I see. I'm going to try to get people from each one of those, and then we'll snowball from there. And you're really targeting. You're really targeting people. You're knocking on doors like, oh, I haven't heard from somebody in the oil and gas industry. I got to go find a few of those folks. Or I haven't heard from any indigenous folks. I got to go talk to them. So, you really, in a theory, it would be great to be very rigorous in that. And that's where we started. But as you start to just back to this co-production and integrating into processes, linking up with social processes, like I talked about yesterday, and on the Gila, we did in-person meetings. So it's the people who showed up to those meetings that we got. We found that they were fairly diverse, but people could say, well, who are you missing? Who's not coming to those meetings? And depending on resources you can invest, we always say to managers, we can get out there, we can do more targeting, in-person meetings and targeted outreach on the Flathead, and I was really driving that process as opposed to linking up with a management process and kind of going with the flow. So I took the extra time to engage with the local tribes, for instance, and I took the time to get into the field. So that one was a little more targeted. We've done online only, so there's a couple online applications of this. If any of you are from Mendocino, California area and want to see this or do it yourself, let me know. I'll send you the link. Shameless plug for data collection. And but press releases, circulation by email, is another way to do it. And then on the Mendocino right now, we're kind of doing a really nice, thorough hybrid method where it's in-person meetings, online, and then that targeted outreach as well. And you can do them you could do it in, kind of public fairs or, those types of gathering, farmers markets, that type of thing as well. And so just to give you kind of this, how it's spanned and varied. And again, we stress the flexibility. As long as you're cognizant of the implications of that, I think that's okay. I don't really spend any time on this, although I'm happy to chat on the analysis, but really it's pretty simple. With the Q sorts, which are those rankings, you're doing factor analysis. So you get 160 of them, whatever, 100 of them, you're doing factor analysis. So you're really just finding, and it's not to be confused with cluster analysis, but there's kind of a nuanced discussion of how it differs in this context. But really, you're finding these shared viewpoints. So if we did it with all of you in this room, we'd probably find about, your connection to the Wasatch Range or something. We'd probably find groups of individuals that kind of did that exercise a similar way. So that's essentially what this method's going to do. And it yields kind of 3 to 5 archetypical or typified viewpoints. And then that drivers of change analysis, how does that connect with that sorting, right? Done some regression analysis, really pretty basic stuff, and then qualitative analysis. If you're starting to kind of layer in these interviews, that is a different kind of set of skills. And what you get is, we'll get to that right now. So I've been talking a lot about how do you get to these, what are you thinking about in the pre-work? How do you engage with folks, have them do this work and do this exercise? How do you kind of briefly, how do you analyze it? What does it yield? It yields kind of our typical relationship about benefit priorities. Patterns around drivers of change. And then kind of this nuance and depth through conversation. And I'll just, instead of explaining that, I'll try to show it to you. So here's one. So this was on the Gila National Forest. We had 100 and on the Gila, 66 people do this, I believe. And it yielded 4 archetypes. An environmental one, you kind of name them for communication's sake. There's limitations in that. Work with the public to name it if you can. One was what we called environmental. We had a water relationship. We had a motorized recreation relationship. We had a utilitarian relationship. And this is kind of what they look like. And you often try to ground test these. You bring them back to people and say, hey, do you see yourself in one of these? And often people, yeah, that one's not exactly me, but it's close. That's kind of what you're looking for, because it is an average of the grouping. So if we did it in this room and we had this front row that kind of had shared their viewpoints, it would kind of average your viewpoints and come up with one that's close, is the idea. But what you can see here is I've color coded this. People kind of enjoy just a visual aesthetic of it, but like the blue is the regulating services. This is using kind of the ecosystem services framework. So there's environmental things, water quality, wildlife habitat and connectivity, biodiversity and abundance of plants and animals. Those were 3 top high priority regulating services. In the orange, less important, potentially trade-off stuff, stuff folks maybe don't like. Doesn't always pan out that way. That's why conversations are important, but oil, natural gas and minerals low, livestock grazing, timber production, irrigation for ag. The utilitarian viewpoint looked much different with some of these oranges on that side. Those are the provisioning services, so more like what you extract from the forest. Recreation and leisure cultural services are in the dark green, dispersed camping, non-motorized rec. And then other cultural services are light green. So we had scenic beauty, places where human influence is unnoticeable, public ownership and access to public land. Those were kind of high for this environmental perspective. And then similarities and differences. So you kind of get this like, oh, that's nice for that single person or that single grouping, excuse me. But then you can kind of look at the similarities and differences across these groups. So like I said, I had these 4. You look at you can start to find these consensus items, right? Like, where do people agree? Something we can agree on, maybe. Public ownership and access was pretty important to environmental, utilitarian, and motorized. So here's the common ground of some folks who might not always have common ground. I thought solitude was an interesting finding in this one. Solitude, quiet, and clear night sky. The environmental folks saw that as +2, so pretty high. And the motorized group saw that as +3, which, this is kind of a wilderness benefit. And we put it in there because they were doing some wilderness planning. And you can't use motorized vehicles in wilderness, and people are quiet. Motorized people don't like quiet. Well, you know what? They do. They do. All right. They don't think about it that way, probably. Right. So that's like an important thing where there's this common ground between these groups. And you might think, oh, they don't care about quiet. Well, maybe not while they're riding, but once they get there, they turn it off and they soak it in. So there's some commonality there. Biodiversity and abundance, you can see the differences there. Environmental, utilitarian. Now you might think, what does utilitarian like really not want biodiversity? That seems kind of crazy. But this is where those trade-offs come in. When you talk to them, they see that as a conduit to restricting timber, restricting oil and gas, right? Or some of these things. And I'll talk about this at the end, but while this might be, some of these findings this was on the Gila, might not be like, oh, that's not groundbreaking. Tell me something I don't know. Part of the benefit is like, it makes it explicit. Like, we hear you, you came, you're seen. Here are these explicit different perspectives. And then you can also see how they connect to these drivers of change. So this is just basic regression analysis for the Gila folks. But like those environmental, what this means is we interpret this. Here's the drivers of change they thought about: roads and trails, stream flow alterations and diversion, declining Forest Service budgets. I don't know if you can see that back there, sorry. All the way down to invasive species. And the plus means if you were a part of the environmental perspective, if like you tended to sort like the environmental perspective sorted, you were more likely to select kind of the stream flow alterations. Land use restrictions was less likely, meaning if you selected land use restrictions as a driver of change that you thought was relevant or an issue, you were less likely to be an environmental kind of perspective, more likely to associate or more associated with that utilitarian perspective. So this is kind of nice because it fills that story out, we think, anyway. That's why we think it's nice. But it also checks your work a little bit, right? Like, you start to realize, you always wonder in social science, like, did they even understand the survey? Did they get this exercise? Like, were they doing what we were thinking they should be doing? And yet, generally, when you see this, like, I don't know, there's many in here that don't make sense. So you start to realize, okay, reinforces your methods a little bit too. Roads and trails was the thing the motorized folks, honed in on. All right, should move. Here's another example just from the Flathead, unconfined recreation. So you can, here we had more of them. So it's 48. I'm not going to be able to go through all these, but, you can see for the unconfined recreation, a different way to show you these drivers, but negative drivers permit system. So here's the unconfined recreation folks, meaning don't mess with my recreation experience, just let me go when I want to go, how I want to do it. Extended, independent, and self-sustained experiences with limited planning. They were kind of negatively associated with permits. Like, that was a real strong association. These folks were saying no permits, no permits, no permits. And that kind of bears out. And then you can kind of see them across, this slide's a bit much, so hang with me, I get it. But this is all 6 of the archetypes on the Flathead. So we had the indigenous worldview, leisure pursuits, resource and introspection, unconfined rec, exploration and challenge, and outfitter and guide. That's kind of what we named them. And you can just, the numbers there's kind of hard to see in the back, I'm sure. Water quality was number 1. That's always a common uniter across all these. Everybody loves water quality. How can you not, right? Aquatic habitat being, then you can kind of see some of the ones that was number 2. Like Native American history and knowledge is number 9. That one's a little more polarizing, not as important to some, very important to others. So it's just another way to show you how you can kind of compare these. In the Flathead, we kind of rolled this out with the participants, and people spoke to the ones and said, yeah, that one's me, that one's me. And they kind of told them a bit about it. So it really provides the bones for this conversation, right? And this gets back to, can you add some depth and some nuance? And that's what we did on the Flathead. So depth really can be added. Here's one. This was from the indigenous worldview. So like all tribes, I'll read it for the folks in the back. All tribes are looking at their culture and bringing their culture back because believing that makes us stronger in our identity and stronger individuals within our community so that we can move ahead forward into the future with less societal issues of substance abuse, physical abuse, and poverty, issues like that. And that cultural revitalization is dependent on the landscape. So part of when I talked yesterday about that, social learning and kind of engagement and communicating, when you pair those quantitative bits, maybe that's not quite as influential to understanding folks. But I think if you can layer in some of these quotes, then people say, whoa, that is like pretty important to that person and pretty important to that viewpoint, even if you yourself don't kind of abide by it. Another one was, I did this interview with this guy and his wife. He was in tears telling me that literally everything that is my life is centered around my connection with nature. My lifeblood, that's everything for me. So that was kind of this recreation perspective, someone using that North Fork of the Flathead River system. And so, you can bring in this depth and it kind of makes these things explicit. And, what's the impact of that? Even if you don't show up, you can kind of, it makes these things explicit. Like I said, it makes the implicit explicit. Even if you're not there, you can say, oh yeah, maybe that's me. I'm glad someone was there and they kind of said my piece. If you are there, you understand that, this is very transparent. It increases the confidence that, your voice is heard. Increase the understanding of divergent perspectives. So that's kind of what I talked about all day yesterday. But this idea that even if you're one of those 6 on the Flathead, at least you got those other 5 to kind of learn a little bit more about other people. People have mentioned the transparent methods and processes are really appreciated. Distills a lot of input into a manageable story. That's really hard for these managers to do, right? When you come, it's like drinking out of a fire hose. You get all this information. It's like if you don't have something in place to catch that and kind of highlight what you heard, that can be really challenging and can lead to some kind of at least disillusionment in the process. Like, why would I go and tell them that when they're just in one ear and out the other, right? It increases the trade-offs, or it highlights those trade-offs, which I think is pretty important. They realize this is a really hard process, really hard thing. And it highlights the challenging decision-facing managers. I kind of highlighted this yesterday. Like, one of the goals I see is that consensus and understanding, right? From yesterday, where it's like, if folks are walking away saying, that's a really hard thing, I don't know what I would do. I don't really agree with it, but I understand why they went that way. And we found this in the Flathead. It was pretty neat. Like, I sat down with folks and I had them tell me, and so that's where those quotes were from. So let's talk about these archetypes. Do you see yourself in any one of them? Okay, now tell me about them. We'll layer that in and we'll give this all back to the management team and to the public. And then I ended the interview with, well, giving all of these archetypes and all of these kind of interesting drivers and challenges in the sociological system, what would you do? And I had people say, I don't know. Glad I don't have to make that decision. That sounds really hard. I can sit here and gripe and tell you what I want, but they ultimately have to make that decision. So there seemed to be some level of kind of understanding there. And I think I mentioned that yesterday too, but, and then lastly, considering these challenges, it takes time, money, and expertise. Again, it's another thing to add. And these folks are overstretched. And when I say these folks, I mean managers, they really are overstretched. They got a lot of stuff going on. And so it's like, oh, do you want to do this? And they're like, well, that's like another thing. That can be hard. It's just a snapshot in time. You don't see how people evolve. So if you're doing it now, but it'd be neat to do it now. And then if you go plan again in 10 years, maybe you do it again. And then the connection to outcomes and planning can be hard to highlight. I kind of alluded to this yesterday, but I think the communication benefit is something that I really see for this, because you can really wrangle with one another's different perspectives and understand it's really challenging. But once you have those 6 on the Flathead, or the 4 on the Gila, or the 4 on the Shoshone, different perspectives, they're divergent. If you plan for one, maybe the other's going to be upset, or maybe you plan for a little bit for each one. How do you approach that? I haven't seen that's where my job kind of ends and the manager's begins. And that can be hard to show in some real way. So, you know, people want to know that they're making a difference when they show up to these. That's like rule 101 of public engagement that we talk about in that overarching paper that I highlighted at the beginning. Is like, you're making a promise to the public that if you show up to this room and you're here to pour your heart out and miss your kids' hockey practice to talk to me, that I'm going to make some kind of difference, right? What is this going to be used for? How's this going to be used? And sometimes it can be hard to show that connection. I don't think that's necessarily specific to this method, but it's kind of specific to public engagement overall. And so I'll leave it there. I think we got, 13 minutes. So thanks, everybody.
And we don't have a microphone, so.
Oh yeah, I'll repeat for the Zoom people.
You answer, pick your own people.
Oh yeah, who's got a question?
I think you kind of alluded to this, but I'm just like curious if you have any evidence to show that using these planning processes results in the public